looking at that, we'll probably go straight into what I was supposed to be saying, and that is the carbon pricing. The reason we added this carbon pricing is because we've heard or talked to people that are confused about carbon pricing. And it says carbon, the unit of carbon is important. How do we measure carbon worldwide? And it's 1,000 kilos, it's a ton, because obviously it's a large quantity that we need to measure. Now, there is an important point here that the actual ton of carbon is not the same as what you hear when you hear about the environmental ton of carbon. When the ton of carbon, which is just carbon itself, is quite a lot. But what everybody talks about is the ton of carbon dioxide, that's CO2. And that is important because when we say we are getting a carbon credit for 1 ton, it means it is 1 ton of carbon dioxide, not the actual carbon, because obviously there is less carbon in the carbon dioxide when we're talking a ton of each. And obviously these numbers tell us that it's a factor, try and remember this factor, is 3.67 or 3.667, depending on how accurate you want that. There is 3.67 ratio between the actual ton of carbon and ton of carbon dioxide. Anyway, we'll forget about a ton of carbon now. We'll just talk about a ton of carbon dioxide, which is what everybody says, oh, it's carbon, it's a ton of carbon. It's not, it's actually a ton of carbon dioxide. Okay, now we come to the 1 ton of carbon dioxide. And that means it's 1 ton of carbon dioxide sequestered, locked in, when anybody says that it's a ton of carbon. That is actually what we call, well, this is not many people know that, but it's an eligible emission unit. Now, the reason we call it emission is because we are actually testing the emission of carbon. And the locking in is the opposite. It locks it in. So some are emitting, some are locking in. But they use the word emission so that we know that we're locking what's being emitted. And that's 1 ton of CO2, okay? Now that is the carbon credit unit. So when we hear a carbon credit unit, it means it's 1 ton of CO2 and it is an eligible emission unit. Now, some of these units are regulated by ASIC here in Australia, and some are unregulated. Now, the ones that are unregulated doesn't mean that they are illegal. It just means they are unregulated. So if you end up buying a carbon credit that is unregulated, it doesn't mean that you've lost your money. You could still sell it. But it means you cannot trade with that, okay, on our stock exchange market, the ASX. You can trade with someone else, but not on the stock market. The ones that are regulated, obviously, are our carbon credits, which are the Australian carbon credits, the AACCU. Now, these are issued by the Clean Energy Regulator, and we have a lot of those that have been already issued. Okay. Now, there's the next ones that are regulated are, we call them emission reduction units. Many types of them, but they are always issued by a party to the Kyoto Protocol. A country that is part of the Kyoto Protocol can issue that emission reduction unit. And in Australia, we can do both, okay? But that would be under the Kyoto Protocol, that will be under our own energy, Clean Energy Regulator. Some, we can't go through all the carbon credit types, but I've just chosen 3 so that we can understand that there are many. Some are certified. What it means that they are certified, it means they are issued in a country where it's a developing country. And sometimes if a country issues a carbon credit in certain countries that we don't know who's issuing these credits, when they come into Australia or they come into a country that is part of the Kyoto Protocol, they would have to certify it to make sure that whatever project was issued those carbon credits was a legitimate and certified project. Okay. Now, every carbon credit is like your currency. It has a number, and that serial number has to be registered. Okay, it has to be registered in the Australian National Registry of Emissions. So every time we issue a carbon credit, we have to register it there, and if you buy a carbon credit, you have to check that it is registered there. It will have the name and the number, just like your currency. As if you're holding $100 with a number. It has to have a serial number, and that serial number is unique. It cannot be doubled up anywhere in the world. Okay, and that would be our registry that we will be looking at all the time.